All right, so hi everyone. 4 years ago, I was here at the forum and I had to talk about football, and I'm here again and I'm talking about football again. So it's footy finals time at the moment. We've got Collingwood and GWS facing off tonight. But instead of talking about the finals, I'm going to be talking about how you get into the finals. And to get to the finals, you need to finish in the top 8 on the AFL ladder, and which is obviously this table of the results across the season. And this is called a ladder in Australia, but elsewhere it's called different things. So in the UK and Ireland, I think it's normally called a table or a league table. In the US, North America, it's standings or rankings. And I think in South Africa, I've even noticed that they called it a log, is a term that they use there. But yeah, we call it a ladder. But of course, these are ladders. So what I'm going to be talking about, trying to answer today, is like, how did we start using the word for these things to refer to that table of results that we were just looking at? And so I did this by looking at the Trove website, looking at all the old newspapers there and seeing what I could find there. And to begin with, going back at least to the 1860s, probably much further before that, but I just didn't look further ago than that. We have metaphorical ladders being used, and these are instances of the kind of metaphors like often Johnson identified about high status being up, good things being associated with the up direction. That's the wrong way. So yeah, for example, we have this. Garibaldi is on the top rung of the ladder of popularity. So high status is there at the top of the ladder. We have this. Copyright law for art is a very necessary step in the ladder of colonial progress. So again, this is kind of things getting better towards the top of the ladder. We do then start to find these metaphorical ladders being used in sporting contexts. So being on the top of the ladder is about sporting success. Here we have, starting about halfway down there, we've got, we must be content with our position on the lowest rung of the ladder of Australian racing fame. So they're at the bottom of the ladder in this instance. And then we get it in terms of football specifically. So in 1882, we have this, the old saying, practice makes perfect, is just as true today in 1882 as it ever was. Unless our boys take more of the same practice, they will not be at the top of the ladder this year. So this is kind of a bit of the development of ladder. But then meanwhile, in terms of how the table has come about, this results table is only also being developed around about the same time. So the organised football competitions of the VFA and the South Australian Football Association, they're only established in 1877. Up to that point, games are just kind of ad hoc organised between clubs, so there was no real reason to collate results across a whole season. So yeah, the oldest table that I was able to find was this one from 1878. It's the first thing that starts to look like a ladder as we know it today. In South Australia, this table, though, is known as a scoring list or a score list originally. Give the Victorians second place so far in the association's score list. And there's, yeah, scoring list at the top of that table you can see there. In Victoria, just a few years later, it's not quite the same time, a few years later, we start to find similar tables for Victorian football. So this one from 1885 is just titled Analysis. And then the next year, we have this one, it's called the Premiership List. And this is the term that will kind of dominate for the next little while. But yes, and so they're the kind of the two parts, the ladders and the tables. And now we can start to think about how the two different things have come together. And so we have this example here, 1884, Williamstown, who occupy the lowest rung of the ladder as far as averages go. And so averages is basically referring to results. So we start to see the connection where specific results determine your position on a ladder. And this is very similar. We have the Melbournes and the universities still occupy the lowest ring of the ladder, having each lost 4 matches. So again, we've got very specific connection between your results and your place on the ladder. And of course, it's also very interesting to see Melbournes and universities, the plural being used for these teams is fascinating as well. So yeah, so to sum up so far, by the mid-1880s, we have ladder being used in relation to football success. And we also have the table being used, but it appears under different titles like scoring list or premiership list. But there are indications that the two concepts are starting to be brought together between this metaphorical ladder of fame and the table we're looking at. So this example here, we have gradually gone down the ladder of fame. It allowed Port Melbourne to beat it, basically. So yeah, they lost the game, and as a result, they've gone down the ladder of fame. And by 1887, the link is becoming clearer. We've got references to the ladder, also with the table being published right there on the same page right next to it. So at the bottom there, we have South Williamstown. We may yet hope to see them further from the foot of the ladder. And then on the very same page, we have the table there, the premiership list published, and we can see South Williamstown are right there, second from the bottom. We also have here, this is the first instance I could find of the term, the premiership ladder specifically. Yes, so the manner in which this 20 players has climbed the premiership ladder must still be a subject of astonishment to the club members. So then again, on the same page, we can see the premiership list, the table there, and we can see how Richmond are getting up there. And then we start to find specific movements on the ladder being referred to. So we've got Richmond astonished friends and foes alike by putting Fitzroy one rung lower down the premiership ladder. So very specific movement there. And again, we can see that visually in the table published on the very same page. And so by the 1890s, this kind of equivalence between this table, this premiership list, and the concept of the ladder is very well established. So we have many kind of citations turning up by now. So we have position on the premiership ladder, supreme position on the ladder of premiership fame, raise them a step up the premiership ladder. And then this last example I love here. Had they been defeated in these games, the bottom step of the ladder would have been called upon to accommodate them. And then just a few more as well. Port Melbourne would claim a higher rung on the ladder. They will ascend the premiership ladder a rung or two before the end of the season. And defeat by Essendon had shoved them down a rung or two on the premiership ladder. And we can see that this metaphor of the ladder is very much still alive. So people, when they're talking about this ladder in a football sense, they're very much thinking about the object of a ladder as well. They're talking about rungs and steps. And we have this example as well, where we talk about getting a foothold specifically on the premiership ladder. So you can see people are thinking still about actually the action of climbing a ladder. By the late 1900s, we get references to very specific numbered positions on the ladders. So we've got second position on the ladder, third place on the premiership ladder. They take the second top rung on the ladder. So it's basically complete now, this connection between ladder and the table of results. So basically, it's now, except this is just a word that is used to refer to the table, but it's very much still a kind of unofficial word. The table itself is still kind of officially known by and titled with other words like premiership table or premiership list, for example. And then just kind of a bit of background history for the next section. In 1897, the Victorian Football Association has split into the Victorian Football League and the Victorian Football Association. So now we've got two competing leagues going on there, just to explain some of the next few slides. But basically, so it takes a couple more decades, but then eventually by the 1930s is when we get it becoming more of an official term, and it's actually being used as a title at the top of this table. So the Sporting Globe was the first one I could find it using as a title, league ladder in 1932. We look at the Herald. This is 1932. They haven't quite got there yet. In the headline, they're happy to talk about tussle for the highest two rungs of the league ladder. You can see the table itself, well, you can't see it too well, but it says how league clubs stand is the actual title that they use above the table. And how they stand, you can see the connection with the kind of American standings is the term that they use there. In 1934, again, we have sixth position on the league ladder being used in the text in this article, but the table itself is still the premiership list in terms of the title they use there. But by 1935, they start publishing it actually under the title of league ladder. And then if we move across to the age, the age is a bit all over the place over the next little bit. But yeah, so 1936, again, in the text of the article, we've got at the head of the VFL Premiership ladder. It sounds very official, but the table itself is still published under Premiership list. 1940, similarly, Melbourne at top of league ladder in the header there, but it's still the list in the actual title of the table. 1942, again, VFL ladder is there in the article, but it's still, now they've moved over to how clubs stand as the title they're using for the actual table. 1944, 45. 1944, it's very interesting. We've got the league ladder in quotation marks actually being used in the text there, but we have position of clubs as the title of the actual table there. In 1945, we've got a new title again. This is now the League Four, because back then it was just the top 4 teams that made it through to the finals then. By 1946, we eventually get to ladder being used as a title for the VFA, but the league is still being called a list here. It's back to being a league list. And even in that same year, we have league leaders being used. And also, this is fascinating, the top goal scorers are listed under the heading, the VFL goal lists. So I love this word, goal lists, for goal scorer. Finally, 1947, the league ladder is used for the league, but the VFA there back to how clubs stand. So it's still very confused. But eventually, by 1949, we've got ladder being used for both the VFA and the league, and for the rest of the archive, which is just through till 1954 is what was on Trove, just still ladder through there. And so basically, just briefly, this is a very crude analysis I did in terms of the number of results that were turning up for my Trove searches. But of all the results for football ladder, or like football and ladder together in the same kind of result, 14% of them in the 1900s also talked about rungs. And then we can see this decline over the decades to go much, much, much lower. So basically, people are still talking about ladders, but they're talking about rungs of ladders a lot less, which seems to indicate to me that the metaphor is no longer as vivid in people's minds. So just kind of wrap things up now. So ladder metaphors have been around since at least 1860. If I found it, we've got results tables since the late 1870s. The connection is made between them, then grows stronger over a few decades. Eventually, ladder is clearly kind of an unofficial synonym for premiership list or other terms like that. It takes a couple more decades until the 30s and 40s before it becomes a kind of official name that is used in these publications. And as it's become more and more established, more and more just the official normal name, then we can see that the vitality of the metaphor has waned over that period as well. And just in terms of further research that could be done, very interesting to think about how it's spread to other sports as well. I've found this is just the NBL. I looked up the basketball league. They listed understandings on their website, but then they had this advertising header at the top of the thing, which calls it a ladder. So they're a bit confused. And I also found this tweet in relation to Australian soccer. So this is Australian soccer particularly, and this person was complaining about this website, calling it a ladder. They think it's too Australian for them, or too Oz for them. So it's interesting to see that some people are noticing ladder as being too Australian. And that's it. And that's also a cartoon I found from 1936, which very much plays on the ladder metaphor in terms of the football. All right, thank you, everyone.